A single dad was 47 minutes late. Not 5, not 10. 47 long minutes that felt like an eternity to the woman sitting alone at the corner table of a quiet cafe. Outside, the rain painted silver lines across the windows while people hurried past without noticing her. The waitress had already asked twice whether she wanted to order something else, but she simply smiled and said she was still waiting. Most people would have left. Most people would have assumed they had been forgotten, but something inside her told her to stay. Every morning for the past 7 months, she had watched the same man stop on his way to work for someone no one else even seemed to notice. He always carried an old blue backpack, wore the same faded jacket, and held the tiny hand of his 8-year-old daughter as they crossed the street together. And every single morning, he helped the same woman. She wasn't famous. She wasn't rich. She wasn't even someone people looked at for very long. She sat on the sidewalk beside an abandoned newspaper stand with a worn blanket folded beside her wheelchair. Most people hurried around her as though she were invisible. Some looked away out of guilt. Others pretended they had never seen her. But the single dad always stopped. Sometimes he brought her fresh coffee before taking his daughter to school. Sometimes it was a warm breakfast sandwich, wrapped carefully in paper. On colder mornings, he carried an extra pair of gloves. During winter, he quietly left a thick blanket beside her without saying who it came from. He never asked for recognition. He never took photographs. He never recorded videos for social media. His daughter would kneel beside the elderly woman, smile brightly, and spend a few minutes talking about school, books, birds, or whatever exciting thing had happened the day before. Those few minutes transformed the woman's entire day. Even strangers began noticing. Office workers smiled as they passed. A bus driver occasionally waited an extra moment while the father finished helping. The cafe owner across the street started placing an extra cup of hot tea near the woman every Friday after watching the father for months. Kindness, it seemed, had quietly become contagious, yet no one knew the father's story. No one realized that he himself struggled to pay rent every month. His wife had passed away 4 years earlier after a sudden illness that left enormous hospital bills behind. Since then, he had balanced 2 jobs while raising his daughter completely alone. He slept barely 5 hours each night. Sometimes dinner consisted of simple soup because money was running low. Sometimes he skipped meals entirely, so his daughter never had to. Still, every morning, he found enough to help someone else. His daughter once asked him why. He simply smiled. Because kindness isn't measured by what we have. It's measured by what we're willing to share. Those words stayed with her forever. The woman in the wheelchair had never forgotten them either. Neither had the young businesswoman who watched everything from inside the cafe every morning. She noticed the consistency, not once, not twice. Every single weekday. Rain, snow, wind, heat. The father always came, sometimes exhausted, sometimes coughing, sometimes with worry written all over his face. Yet he never walked past without stopping. The businesswoman had built one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the city. She spent most mornings reviewing reports from the same corner table before heading to meetings. At first, she barely paid attention. Then curiosity slowly became admiration. Eventually, admiration became inspiration. She began arriving earlier just to watch those quiet moments unfold. The father never realized he had an audience. He believed nobody noticed, but someone always did. One morning, she finally approached the elderly woman after the father had left. "Who is he?" The woman smiled warmly. "I don't know his last name." "You've never asked?" "He never wanted me to feel like I owed him anything." "What does he do?" "I think he works too hard." The elderly woman laughed softly, "and somehow still finds time to remind me that the world hasn't forgotten me." That answer lingered in the businesswoman's heart all day. For weeks, she wondered what kind of man kept showing up with such quiet faithfulness. Then fate created an unexpected opportunity. A mutual friend arranged a blind date. Neither knew who the other was. Neither recognized the name. Only the time and location had been agreed upon. Saturday, 6 o'clock. The small neighborhood cafe where she usually worked every morning. She arrived exactly on time. 6 o'clock, 6:10, 6:15, 6:20. The messages stopped. No explanation came. The waitress apologized sympathetically. Friends texted, suggesting she leave. Anyone else would have. But she remembered every morning she had watched him patiently, helping someone who had nothing to offer in return. A man capable of that kind of consistency didn't seem like someone who simply disappeared without reason. So she waited. 6:30. 6:40. The rain became heavier. The cafe grew quieter. Only 3 tables remained occupied. Then, at exactly 6:47, the door finally opened. The single father stood completely soaked by the rain, breathing heavily as though he had run several blocks. His jacket was muddy. One sleeve had been torn. His daughter wasn't with him. His eyes carried genuine panic instead of excuses. Before he even sat down, he whispered 4 heartbreaking words. "I'm so terribly sorry." And what he revealed next would completely change the woman's understanding of the man she had quietly admired for months. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Rainwater dripped from the edge of his jacket onto the cafe floor. His breathing was uneven, and his hands trembled, not from fear of rejection, but from exhaustion. He looked like someone who had fought an invisible battle before arriving. "I'm sorry," he repeated softly. "If you want to leave, I'll understand." The woman looked into his eyes. There was no arrogance, no careless attitude, only honesty. She simply asked, "What happened?" He hesitated, not because he wanted to hide the truth, because he wasn't used to talking about himself. Finally, he answered, "On the way here, I saw Mrs. Eleanor." The businesswoman immediately recognized the name. The elderly woman in the wheelchair. She had collapsed. Everything suddenly made sense. He explained that while walking toward the cafe, he noticed several people standing nearby, watching from a distance. Some had taken out their phones. Very few had actually helped. Without thinking, he rushed to her side. She had difficulty breathing. Her hands were ice cold. He called an ambulance. Then he stayed beside her, holding her hand until the paramedics arrived. When they asked whether he was family, he simply replied, "No, but nobody should be alone." The ambulance couldn't leave immediately because they needed information. He searched through the small bag attached to her wheelchair. He found emergency contact numbers. He called each one. Most didn't answer. One number had been disconnected. Finally, an old church volunteer picked up. Only after knowing someone was on the way did he leave. By then, 47 minutes had passed. The woman across from him listened silently. Her heart felt heavier with every sentence. "You still came," she whispered. He nodded. "I promised I'd be here. You could have canceled. I could have. Why didn't you?" He smiled sadly. "Because being late is different from breaking your word." Those words stayed between them for several seconds. She realized she had spent years meeting successful people who always spoke about discipline, ambition, and leadership. Yet the greatest example of character she had ever witnessed sat across from her, wearing a torn jacket and apologizing for saving someone's life. They ordered coffee. Conversation became effortless. He talked about his daughter, how every decision he made centered around giving her a better future. He admitted money was tight. He worked mornings at a maintenance company, evenings delivering groceries, weekends repairing furniture whenever extra work appeared. She listened carefully. He never complained, not once. Instead, he laughed while describing funny moments with his daughter. He proudly showed photos from her school science project. He spoke about her dreams, as though they mattered more than his own. Hours passed unnoticed. When they finally walked outside, the rain had stopped. Streetlights reflected across wet sidewalks. Before leaving, he thanked her for waiting. She smiled. "I think you were exactly where you needed to be." Neither realized that their conversation had been quietly observed. The cafe owner knew the elderly woman. He knew the father's routine, and he knew the businesswoman's identity. The next morning, news spread throughout the neighborhood. Mrs. Eleanor had survived. Doctors said another 10 minutes without help might have been fatal. People praised the paramedics. Others praised the hospital. But almost nobody knew the name of the man who had refused to leave her side. Except one person, the businesswoman. Instead of telling anyone, She chose silence. She wanted to know whether his kindness had been a single heroic moment, or simply who he really was. Over the next several weeks, she continued watching from a distance. Nothing changed. He still brought breakfast, still smiled, still encouraged his daughter to greet Mrs. Eleanor before school. He acted exactly the same, as though saving her life had been nothing extraordinary. That was when the businesswoman made a decision. She wouldn't judge him by one date. She would judge him by consistency, and consistency never lies. What she planned next would change not only his future, but the future of hundreds of struggling families who had never even heard his name. Months passed. The relationship grew slowly, built not on expensive gifts or glamorous vacations, but on trust. The businesswoman never revealed the size of her company. The single father never asked. He liked her because she listened. She admired him because he lived his values every single day. One afternoon, she invited him to visit the office where she worked. He expected a small startup. Instead, he stepped into the headquarters of one of the city's largest technology companies. His eyes widened. Employees greeted her respectfully. Executives stood as she entered conference rooms. Only then did he realize who she truly was. Embarrassed, he quietly apologized. "I don't belong here." She smiled gently. "You're exactly the kind of person who belongs here." He didn't understand, until she led him into a meeting filled with senior executives. She projected photographs onto a large screen, not company charts, not financial reports. Pictures taken from the cafe over 7 months. There he was, helping Mrs. Eleanor cross the street, sharing breakfast, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, holding an umbrella over her wheelchair, sitting beside the ambulance. None of the photos had been staged. None had been taken for publicity. Every image captured quiet moments of compassion. The room remained silent. Then she spoke. "For years we've searched for leaders with experience." She looked toward him. "But character cannot be taught." She announced a new community outreach foundation, funded entirely by the company. Its mission would provide meals, transportation, emergency assistance, and companionship for elderly people living alone. She wanted him to lead it, not because he had a business degree, not because he had connections, because he had already been doing the work when nobody was watching. He tried to refuse. "I'm not qualified," she answered with a smile. "You've been qualified every morning." The board unanimously agreed. His first decision surprised everyone. The foundation would not bear his name. Instead, it would be called the Eleanor Project, honoring the woman who unknowingly reminded an entire community that invisible people deserve to be seen. Within a year, thousands of volunteers joined. Local cafes donated meals, doctors offered free health screenings, students visited nursing homes. Small acts multiplied into something extraordinary. His daughter became the youngest volunteer ambassador, encouraging children to perform one act of kindness every week. Mrs. Eleanor recovered fully. She eventually stood at the opening ceremony, tears filling her eyes as she watched hundreds of her because one exhausted father had refused to walk past a lonely woman. The businesswoman later admitted something that made everyone smile. "The best business decision I ever made wasn't hiring an executive." She looked toward the man standing beside his daughter. "It was waiting 47 extra minutes." Sometimes life doesn't reward the richest person. It rewards the one who keeps showing up for others, even when nobody is watching. Because genuine kindness has a remarkable way of returning, often in ways no one could ever imagine.